Okay. Huh. It's taking forever. All right, here we go. So the thing I want to talk about today came as a surprise over the weekend. Dan got the database, the Postgres SQL stuff working in a manner of speaking for Zulip. So rather than kind of digging through all the Python ORM stuff, he checked to see if Postgres had a listen. So it turns out that Postgres SQL does have a listen, and so he was able to listen for the SQL and figure out the tables. And then again, because the code that's being used is in ORM, the mapping to SQL is more in alignment with what you do with a tuple space anyway. In general, there are lots of different ways you can map the object stuff onto the tuple space, but just to give you an idea of one way that can go is if you think about the JSON representation of an object, then so that would be object name and then open squirrely brace and then field value, comma, field value, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right. So and you can I've shown how to give interpretations of JSON directly into Rolang. So that gives you a sense of how you might map ORM calls to SQL onto onto calls to Rolang. And Dan has a slightly different but similar similar mapping, so that the SQL is being called, and he's going to give a demo this Wednesday, or at least he's at least initially committed to doing that, schedule permitting. So people should, if they want to see it in action, come for Wednesday. But so what this, because it's a listen on the SQL rather than directly hacking into the Python, that means that the result of this work is that the record of all the chat is being stored on chain. But we don't have the issue of the of the latency or having to do some kind of caching. So that's already at least we have a first step in this direction, and then we can kind of go groveling through the ORM and replace those calls. Need to think a little bit about the requirements here in terms of what it is we want to demonstrate. But this is a good step, and it was sort of in alignment with the complexity that I was thinking about. It'll be a little bit more complex to go and figure out the ORM calls, but another approach, which is kind of like what Steve was suggesting, but a little bit more contained, is just to take the ORM thing like Django and do rather than do a mapping of SQL to rspace/Rolang, instead do a mapping of the ORM to rspace, and that would be that would then give us coverage of a lot of different applications that use this kind of ORM mechanism. So let me just stop there and see if there are any questions about this.
And this is a solution for the direct access. If we want to search something that's another topic, right?
If you want to search, you can use Rolang to search, right?
I mean, more like a text search. For
Oh,
example,
if you want to do text search, yeah, then you have more work to do.
Okay.
Yep. You'll have to pull over the text and do some search after you pull the text out of the database.
So can the listen be selectively applied? Meaning, can I say for this message, go ahead, save on the chain, and only then does listen come into play?
You'd have to analyze the SQL coming through, but in principle you can do that, yeah.
Okay.
We've been
yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, you finish your thought because mine is a slightly tangential point.
Yeah, well, I guess I had a couple of, but just in terms of text searching, we had been talking about a subset of regular expression support, like file pattern searching. If we were to add a string function to do pattern matching, that would allow us to do full text searching, correct?
Well, I mean, it would allow you to do searching to the extent that you can with pattern matching.
Okay, Dan said this was a combined approach using the SQL Dart chain, where I guess his class is an ID database to row, where your ID, every record has an ID, which is interesting. I guess that's handles a lot of cases. They were saying he was doing a combined approach with MQ. Now, I don't see any code for that currently, but I guess to actually deliver the messages, he would be interfacing with the RabbitMQ.
We didn't talk about that, so I haven't. I wouldn't. That's not what was in the scope of our discussion yesterday. It can certainly be combined with an MQ approach, but in general, the point is to get the record of reference. So one way to think about it is that you can use a database as transport, and you can use a transport as storage. The main issue with either of those, what separates those two is typically storage provides some kind of searching mechanism and transport doesn't. And often, though not always, often transport is non-transactional. You can enlist queues in transactions, for certain kinds of queuing systems. So I think Microsoft's message queuing technology supports enlisting in transactions. I don't think Rabbit does. IBM, I think, the IBM MQ series, if memory serves, I could be wrong about this, but if memory serves, you could enlist those in transactions. If you don't have the ability to enlist them in transactions, there are windows of loss for information unless you have acknowledgments on the other side that you ensure you receipt before you let data go, which is basically like mimicking a transaction. That said, you know, the requirements here is we're interested in storage, not transport. At least that's the way I would put it. Transport is a separate problem, and we can and should be able to replace the transport without impacting the fact that the data is being stored on chain. So that's the way I would think about this particular application and problem. But we, you know, I'm sure we'll have lots of active discussion about that. The one thing that Dan rightly points out is key management. So if we are going to use encryption as the means of privacy, then that raises the ugly issue of key management with respect to encryption. Now, Discord does something along these lines, so it's not infeasible. It's just that, you know, it's going to be a little bit more work on our part, a little bit more skull sweat and and care taken. But really, that's all I wanted to chat about today, and, you know, get us excited about the fact that you know, it's relatively straightforward to do this kind of thing. You know,
so I wanted to comment on a couple of things that are both immediate and near future related to this. One,
sure.
In terms of immediately people looking for transactions on our chain, you know, where did my transaction go? What is the state of that? I think this business of querying the queue or the storage, I think is something that needs to be thought about and improved. We have the revdefine.io that Will developed. There probably needs to be some more robustness put into that to see how it can be made easier and for people. I mean, even we have that issue internally when we want to look at the staking data and all that kind of stuff. That's one thing. I think this triumvirate of storage, the queue, and the query needs to be resolved. But I think on a larger canvas, this is what we have to look into in terms of enterprise integration if we want to develop solutions for bringing in or integrating with existing systems for the enterprise. What's the integration mechanism? What's the right pattern or set of patterns we can create here to simplify that, where we can be ready to out of the box to be able to be easy to integrate. That's the second point I want to make. And the third one, also related to integration, but I think basically integration is two pieces. Legacy integration is two pieces. Legacy integration, part of that is technology, to say, okay, you know, if you have a RabbitMQ based system, here is our replacement for it, because we have AQMP or whatever protocol built on top of Rolang. Or if you have SQL, you know, this is our answer to that as to how you would migrate from that. So we can look at that from those kinds of technology-based or protocol-based replacements to say, what do we tell them as to how do you easily slide in our chain into your existing infrastructure? That's one part of that. The other part to look at is talent. Because legacy integration means we have to be, they need to be able to use talent where people have competence in some package or the other, or the language, like a Python or or whatever, and we should be able to say, okay, talent-wise, how are we compatible in addition to technology-wise? I think if we address those things, integration and sliding our chain into existing infrastructures would be relatively easier. Any comments on that?
So I'm trying to understand the scope of your concerns. I mean, are you concerned about this when taking this to the co-op, or are you concerned about taking this to potential investors, or what's the scope?
Yeah, I'm more the latter, in that this is not just about chat systems. This is not just about whatever. I mean, surely we can have a proof initially in one or the other domain or in one or the other application, even like Zulip. But I'm really more interested in what's the story to tell and how can we leverage this effort into either creating or at least defining those tracks that I just outlined, so that when we go to an investor, it's a credible and complete story with some proof points available for what we do.
Can I address that a little bit?
Sure,
Yeah,
go ahead.
Jim.
I think what you're getting toward is, you've got all these people that have invested a great deal in applications, which may be like Java applications. And if we can tell them that, any JDBC database can be configured to run on our chain, and every JMS messaging service can be configured to work on our chain. That gives them a direct path to at least prototype, get their system onto our chain. Is that the kind of thing you wanted?
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, they are just the two things. And maybe there is, there are these protocols also, right, beyond the JMS and JDBC. Certainly JMS and JDBC would be high priority. But AQMP, which is what RabbitMQ supports, or MQTT, which is the IoT protocol standard. So I think if we think about what's out there already that people are building to or have built to, and say, how do we then have a veneer of that on top of our chain, then I think it'll be easier for people to work with. I mean, I'm thinking in terms of what components do we need to make to have the solutions SPV be successful, right? And to me, it seems like these are some of the components we need to have.
I guess we should really find out from prospective customers what they would want. I mean, Theo and I have been investigating the AMQP interface, which RabbitMQ supports.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, but like, for example, a lot of you have to understand, we could go chasing technologies until the cows come home. I think that's not a good way to go. You want to look at specific end user scenarios. Now, the end user can be the enterprise, but you need to talk about specific enterprises and specific scenarios within the enterprise. And rather, because it's very, very costly to chase technologies. And you need to think very carefully, especially in a resource constrained situation, about exactly which scenarios you want to support and why you want to support them. So in the case of the Zulip, I'm not chasing a technology. In fact, I pick, you know, one of the, you know, not a technology base that isn't best in terms of all the bells and whistles, but has an adoption within a community that we want to be engaged with and influence and be influenced by. So that's the way I would approach this. Look at it not in terms of chasing technologies, because there are lots and lots of those, and there are all kinds of like AMQP, for example, is a really good example of, you know, a lot of infighting within the message community about what really is to be accepted and what isn't to be accepted. You know, like there was a big backlash against AMQP that was, you know, where the gap was filled by 0MQ and lots of other things like that, because, you know, people, whenever there's a, you know, proposed standard, people want to buck the standard in various ways, or find a wedge to get their own particular technology involved. So I would be really, I wouldn't look at it from the point of view of chasing standards or technologies. I would look at it from the point of view of chasing particular scenarios, particular user stories. And most importantly, let's make sure that the user stories initially serve the co-op directly, you know, specifically serve needs of the co-op with an eye to how that might, you know, expand to serving the needs of other communities.
What about, you know, looking at, you know, application areas like supply chain management, you know, the 5 top open source tools for supply chain management? If we look at those and say, well, you know, this particular implementation, it might be best for migrating to ArtChain. And in order to do that, these are the protocols we would want to support.
Again, I think that's getting better, but the way I would do this is wait until we have at least some indication that there's a paying customer on the other end of that. And the reason is that I don't think that ArtChain is ready to be deployed in any kind of supply chain management situation, and probably won't be for the next 3 years at a minimum. As I've tried to say, the analysis of each of the different markets should run least risk, highest transactions. So you start with the markets where you have high transaction volumes, and if you drop a couple of transactions on the floor, you don't care. Because ArtChain is definitely gonna, you know, cause problems, as we just saw with, you know, slashing on Theo's validator. And we don't want to insinuate this technology in a, you know, mission critical situation until we have shaken a lot of the bugs out. So you know, you start, I mean, chat right now, nobody's going to care if we drop some messages on the floor, or if it takes a week to deliver a message or something like that, at least initially, because it's all just an experiment. Over time, as the co-op depends more and more on this, then yes, it will become more important that it perform appropriately. So we have to look, you know, and that's why I wanted to start with music, because music gives you high transaction volumes by comparison to all the other markets, and nobody's going to die if you drop a song on the floor. But whatever it is, you know, that's the analysis framework, which is high transaction volumes, lower risk. and then we can start looking at, you know, expanding out from there to other markets, you know, in terms of that particular vector. So we want to, again, this is just my analysis. Other people, your mileage may vary, but my way of thinking about it is start with those, you know, identify those user scenarios where you have high transaction volumes, low risk, and then move out from there towards, you know, more B2B or enterprise kinds of things. And then you can take on more and more risk, you know. So, you know, here's an example, right? Can you get sued if you deliver the wrong map to people? So could we contemplate a Google Maps kind of offering? So that's like in between high risk, and because, you know, Google Maps is used all the time. Most people are using it on a daily basis, and they don't just use it to find locations. They use it as a phone book and all kinds of things. So that's a really, really good one. But the question is whether or not, you know, there's a lot of risk if you deliver the wrong map. The other thing that's really nice about, you know, a Google Maps like scenario is because it's almost entirely or exclusively read only. There's a, and that's the same with the music thing. The thing that was really nice about the music thing is the write and the read are well separated. So that makes our lives a lot easier. The provisioning of digital assets is a, you know, separate, you know, pipeline that can be managed by people who know what they're doing, and the masses are just, you know, the end users, the people who are generating most of the transactions, they're doing read-only operations. So that's, you know, another way to think about the different scenarios. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, this basically is, you're saying low risk communications, media, entertainment, games, potentially, or some of the initial things to look at. And in terms of the the industry applications we want to go into, like Jim mentioned, supply chain management. But even within supply chain management, there are low risk parts and the high risk parts, and potentially the low risk part can be handled initially. So I guess that's kind of what we're looking at, is low risk, high volume, even in the potential domains where there may be high risk pieces. Yeah, so I think something like that we could target. Now, as far as the standards and technologies and not going after them, there is a filter that reduces your risk, and the filter is market share, right? So if you know that these are the broadly deployed technologies that we need to either eventually integrate with or replace, if you take the market share filter, you won't have hundreds that you pursue. You would be able to come up with things that are relatively contained as a list to go after. But it may be just fine to do what you're saying, which is start with the domains that we're able to serve at this point in time, but within there, take the standards and protocols and technologies filter with a market share filter, so that we can say, well, you know, like in this, when we are trying to solve the Zulip problem, if we do XYZ, we would have solved the problems for all chat systems, or we would have become more ready for all the chat systems. Things like that. I think we can still look at that angle. So.
Sure. I mean, I would really welcome a market analysis, right? But, you know, again, I think, you know, we don't want to lose sight of the forest for the trees, or in this case, it's the other way around. I mean, we really want to deliver a working system, right? And we really want the co-op to use it, because then we can have then we can have testimonials from our own community. Yeah, it works. I use it, right? We're basing our business on this, right? And that's like the biggest, most important thing that you can say to an investor. Yeah, the co-op runs its business on this tech stack. Then that, like that's what they want. They want to see that, you're willing to put your money where your mouth is. So I'm, that's, yes, there are lots and lots of technologies and requirements that we can go after. But remember that into the enterprise, the sales cycle by and large is about 18 months. The sales cycle in in more sensitive business areas is longer, right? If you're selling into the biotech sector, into a sensitive area, it can be 24 months or even longer. It's good to be prepared to address those kinds of lengthy sales cycles, but we need to work with communities that will adopt our technology relatively quickly. And that's why having a chat system like this is a good idea, because we can adopt it, and then if we make it snazzy enough, then other crypto communities may adopt it. And I'm interested in having the category theory community adopt it, right? I'd like them to be able to proudly say, hey, this uses category theory inside, so that's why we're using it. That would be a good testimonial. So I mean, I think we're all on the same page, but I just want to make sure that there's some structure, right? Because there's a vast landscape of technologies and user stories and market, and if we can find some jujitsu moves to minimize our effort and get maximum bang for buck, that would be where I would want to go.
I mean, given the issues that we're going to be facing for years here, it would seem to me that to make the stack useful today, what we would need is a way for one shard to deploy Rolang on another shard. And what that will
we've got that, right? I mean, in the sense that anyone can be a client of a shard, right? If you know a validator, you can be a client of a shard, and that means that a shard can be a client of a shard. The real issue is whether or not there's any sort of transactional semantics connected between the deployments on shards.
I'm talking about having a power box function, that lets us, deploy directly from Rolang.
Sure. I mean, that's something that will be available once we have the rest of the spec for for sharding.
My feeling is that if we provide that basic mechanism, then sharding techniques will evolve. We don't have to have one that we designed up front, because we can use, the prototypes that, Mike Stay has already written. We can experiment with different ideas.
Sure, but then it's kind of all bets are off in terms of any transactional semantics. right? If you don't lay that down, then nobody can be guaranteed that there's any exchange transaction semantics, right? Like if you don't know that there's a particular kind of backing ratio between the two shards, or you don't understand what the mechanism is because it's it's the wild and woolly internet, then
Do we care? I mean, if somebody,
yeah, people really will
if
care.
somebody does a deploy, okay, they're using their private key to deploy it, and the other shard is going to charge. They're going to pay for it, right? So anytime you need a global consensus, you have to go to the primary shard to get it.
Well, you won't know that you've got consensus if you don't know what the mechanism is between the shards.
I don't know why you're caring. You mean
no, I don't care. It's the question of what the question is whether or not a particular client cares. Right?
Yeah.
If a client cares that, I mean, typically the reason you care is because you want to have some kind of reliability or and authentication between that's associated with the transactions that cross the shards, right? So if you've got a transaction that involves in different shards or resources in different shards, then you're not going to be satisfied unless that transaction has some kind of guaranteed semantics. That's the issue.
Well, there's, other issues. It's like, how do you listen to a remote channel and things like that? That's what I guess the power box would have to handle. But if I'm a user, okay, let's take it down to the fully decentralized case. I'm one user. I have one standalone system where I run my Rolang. Okay, my client is in essence a client. The main shard is the server. Okay, and I have applications running on my client, and occasionally I want to post those to the back end, which is the main shard. Okay, and I see that as being incredibly valuable for the individual because I love writing stuff and running it myself in Rolang, and I don't need it on the chain at all for most of it.
Okay, yeah, that's a different contemplated set. I mean, it is a reasonable set of requirements, and it's different than the ones we're talking about, right?
Well, if you step it up one step, you have an application like the blockchain, art on the blockchain, and they want to be able to run their own chart, have their own thing, and then post to the blockchain, to the main chain, because they don't, they want to run it as a service for free, basically, support it, but obviously, they would not have, their financial transactions would have to be posted back to the main shard.
Okay. I mean, there are lots of things that we can contemplate, and I heartily recommend, it's open source code. People can make R-chip proposals and just, hack to their heart's content. I think that's a great thing, and that's extremely decentralized. I mean, like Arthur Grief has got an application, and he's putting in pull requests to advance the node that so that it will ultimately support his application requirements. And I think that's a fantastic model. That that means that anyone is empowered to use our code and can improve the offering and give back to the community, right? I mean, every application user that's using the node benefited from all the hard work of all the developers in our chain, and and the resources of the community. So if they provide features back to the community, that's beginning to be more balanced and reasonable. And that's the open source model.
Speaking of features and power boxes and R chips, the
yeah, we got, I think the question you were asking, Jim, about whether this serialization should be a Erlang feature or not.
yeah, it's really, what's the meaning of these constructs that we used to call power box functions, which have their origin in the object capability realm, and they have to do with external connections. As to Thomas Love's name, that these are special names. They don't have to be external. And I guess Dan is suggesting that, well, there's no reason it can't be a function to stream the, to serialize. So I guess I just wanted your take on that.
So serialization is a really interesting case, right? Because in general, you have to pick a format, right? And that format and the extent to which that format has a broad scope, then there's more of an argument for making it, a function of Erlang. And the extent to which it has a more narrow scope is the argument that it's a power box function. That would be the principle or criterion that I would apply in making these kinds of decisions. So, you understand what I'm driving at? It's like the issue with serialization is it's always specific to some computational environment. It's like you can't make a generic one. I mean, I guess the most generic you can go to is strings, but even that is fraught, all right? Because is it ANSI? Is it does it support international? It's like all of these questions come up about scope and computational environment. And the more that's nailed down, the more it starts to look like a power box thing. So that's the best I can give in terms of experience-based, criterion.
I wonder if the ease or difficulty of key management is another criterion. I'm not sure. In some situations, I guess the handling of the keys is going to be very painful. But I want to return to what Jim was saying about sharding or incremental sharding. I think it makes sense to think of that as different levels of MVP for sharding. And certainly I encourage Jim and others to put the R chips in there so that we can process those. And speaking of which, I guess, what's the full spec on sharding effort? When is that going to be done already? Now we have block merge completed from a spec standpoint, or it is in discussion anyway at this point in time. Should we initiate the sharding spec? And perhaps
I don't think we have the bandwidth for it, to be honest. I mean,
okay.
let's get these other things done, and once we've got them done, then I think we can start looking at that.
I think if we start experimenting with the existing shard documentation, we'll have a better idea of how it needs to be different.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would to be honest, I would be like putting attention on whether or not the N of K contract actually does its job. That's a relatively well-contained problem, and I mean, and if it doesn't do its job right, then everybody's screwed. So that would be where I put my effort. I mean, the N of K contract has to be bulletproof. All right. Any other questions?
I have a question not for you, Greg, but I was wondering if Arthur Grief could take a couple of minutes to explain the application he's building, since he's here.
Hey. Yeah, I was building a sealed bid auctioning, and it was a initial step to look at what sort of cryptology with respect to zero knowledge proofs that I could use, with the goal of doing track and trace on supply chain. So it really is tracing in supply chain that was the end goal. But, you know, as Greg was mentioning, in the enterprise space, it's a little complicated because the parts that I'm getting bogged down with is compliance with cryptology, for example. It's not that easy to get things agreed to and approved within the enterprise. But I think the thing that I was, still kind of struggling with is this notion of is how do you really have a external application connect to RChain? You know, I tried two ways of extending RChain. The one was using the DLL approach and trying to wire that up to RChain. And then the other one was using Tomislav's HTTP, neither of which I think is the best approach yet. So I think we still kind of need to work on that a little bit more. But I mean, in the end, I mean, I basically, we have ERP applications, and ultimately you need ERP applications to be the queryable database of record, but then you need to connect up to the distributed ledger.
I guess there's two issues with the HTTP. One is that we don't wait for the response. I think we're waiting for the response. Is that right?
Yeah, I don't think it's a good approach at all.
Yeah. The other thing is that sometimes we want all the validators to check the HTTP, to do the HTTP, and sometimes we don't.
Yeah.
Sometimes we want to treat it like a timestamp, like this is the data that was input, rather than it being repeated by every validator. It's done once and taken as gospel.
Yeah, I think the question for me is that, if something like Postgres has a listen, and Dan was able to use listen, for example, to easily move stuff onto RChain, is the other way as easy? Can you listen for tuple space changes on RChain and move it into a database? So
well, there's listen for data at name. Yeah. So that's the.
But then that's what we should be using, right? I should be looking at that for the type of manipulation.
Well, as part of the AMQP implementation, we're implementing a channel contract that keeps a history and supports publish and subscribe. So you'll be able to get a feed of this. Now, how do you do this from the outside application? Well, obviously there has to be some polling, but when you poll, you can get all of the events that you're waiting, that have happened since your last poll. So you are eventually consistent.
I mean, on blockchain, changes can happen only when block is created, or more concretely, when block is finalized. So if we can, and we can read all of the transactions in the block, we can find out what channel we are interested in, and we can read the data. So it is a pooling, but we know when is the time when the state is changed.
And it gives us an event framework where we essentially can log this happened to a channel, and we can make channels for anything we want to make channels for.
Yeah, I mean the same thing is with transactions. right? Exchanges now, they're reading all of the transactions in the block, and they find this one rev address, and they say, oh, we can see this event is happening, right?
So are there samples for this, or we're saying that this is something that's possible?
Right. Samples for what? Listen for data at name?
Or you mean for transactions?
I don't know what I mean, I think.
Well, I mean, for both, anyway, I guess the good answer is for both of them, they're examples.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think you just might. Now, listen for data at name, I think, is limited to 3 or whatever in the validator nodes, but read only, I don't know what the limitations are. Maybe there are tons of, do you know if there are limitations on the read only for listen for data?
Listen for data at name is good for immediately get the data from the block.
Right.
For example, when you create a deploy, you can get immediately what happened in this block. But
so it's not the finalized. You're recommending that the finalized is the true state of the blockchain.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So that's the difference between the two, Arthur.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe most of the times you want to go for the transaction data, and that we already implemented that for the exchanges. So that's something that you can start with. Listen for data, like Tomislav mentioned, is transient data that if you for some reason need to look at or explore the state of the tuple space. So what I wanted to ask Arthur was, would you be able to either run a learning session or a demo? Would you be ready for that at some point?
Sure, my demo seems to be pretty stable.
You have the UI and all that plugged in?
Yeah, hackable. It's not great. Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay, good. So let's schedule a demo perhaps for, depending on the amount of time you need. We can do it as part of the debrief or otherwise, but I would be interested in a demo. Great.
I mean, we already have Arthur's demo on 2 sessions.
Yeah.
Oh, you did that as part of the learning sessions?
Yeah.
Yes.
I see. Okay.
We can look at
it
we can look at it at the 2 p.m. Eastern Time DApp developer session. Right.
Yeah, but let's do it for the community debrief, because I'm sure the community would be very excited to see what you've done, Arthur. Awesome. That's cool. All right, folks. Well, this was an interesting Casper session. Thanks to everyone. I'll see some of you in the developer stand-up in just a few minutes.
All right. See you, everyone. Thanks.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks.
Thanks.